Okay, so we are going to be looking at Unit 4, Learning Set 7. This matches Section 5.7 in your workbook. And our objectives are to write, interpret, and use the distance formula, and then use the formula for the relationship between distance, fuel economy, and gas usage. So hopefully you remember the distance formula from your previous algebra classes. Okay, so in this first example, a car travels at an average rate of speed of 50 miles per hour for 6 hours. How far does the car travel? So we're going to use the distance formula, and hopefully you remember that that would be distance equals rate times time. So looking at our example, the rate is 50 miles per hour, and our time would be 6 hours. So all we have to do is plug those two numbers in there to figure out the distance. So that would be 50 times 6, which equals 300. So this car traveled 300 miles in 6 hours, going 60 miles per hour. Okay, so for example 2, Jack lives in New York and will be attending college in Atlanta, Georgia. The driving distance between the two cities is 883 miles. So we can see that 833 would be our D variable because it's our distance. Jack knows that the speed limit varies on the roads he travels from 50 miles an hour to 65 miles an hour. So those are rates, but that's not a specific one yet. He figures that he will average about 60 miles per hour on his trip at this average rate. So that means we want to use that 60 miles an hour as our rate. For how long will he be driving? Express your answer, round it to the nearest tenth of an hour and to the nearest minute. So we have our D and our R variables. So we have 2 of the 3 variables. We can plug our information in and solve it using algebra because the numbers aren't all on one side. Divide by 60 and we get 14.716. And don't forget, when there's the line over it, that means it's a non-terminating decimal. So that means 6 goes on forever. In your calculator, you would probably see it as 14.71666666. And then whatever the last space on your calculator is, we'll say 7 because it'll round it up. So the tenth of an hour would be 14.7 hours because we would want to take the 1 and use it to tell us whether or not to round the 7 up. When we're looking at tenth of a minute, remember that this portion in our number represents the portion of an hour. So all we would have to do is take that decimal portion and multiply it times 60 because we know there are 60 minutes in an hour, and that would give us 43 minutes. So we could combine the tenth of an hour together with the tenth of a minute, and we would know that it took him 14 hours and 43 minutes. Okay, so for example 3, Kate left Albany, New York and traveled to Montreal, Quebec. The distance from Albany to the Canadian border is approximately 176 miles. The distance from the Canadian border to Montreal, Quebec is approximately 65 kilometers. So when we look at that, you notice that part of the distance is in miles and part of the distance is in kilometers. So we're going to have to make them the same unit of measure. So if the entire trip took her about 3 3/4 hours, what was her average rate of speed for the trip? So the first thing we want to do is we want to make the entire distance in miles. Okay, so this one is already in miles. Okay. And the second one we need to convert to miles. Okay. So we know 1 kilometer equals 0.671371 miles. So one thing you could do is you could set this up as a proportion to where you put kilometers over miles. So you would set up the ratio 1 over 0.621371. And then we could take the 65 kilometers. The kilometers is going to go on the top. And we want to know how many miles is 65 kilometers. So then we could do our cross multiplication. So you would end up with 1x equals 65 times 0.621371. Or if you don't need to set up as a proportion, you could just go ahead and multiply the two. But that just shows you how we get the 65 times 0.621371 and multiply it, and it equals 40.389115. So from the Canadian border to Montreal is about 40 miles, or 40.4 miles. Okay, so the next thing is we want to find the total driving distance. So we know that they went 176 miles, and we also know that 65 kilometer is equal to 40.4 miles. So what we would do to find the total distance is we would add them together, and we would end up with a total of 216.4 miles. So the next thing is the entire trip took her about 3 3/4 miles. So for time, 3 3/4 hours, I added the distance. I added the distance from Albany to the Canadian border plus the converted Canadian border to Montreal distance to get the entire distance. Okay, so 3 3/4 hours. So time is equal to 3 3/4 hours. Personally, I find it easier to use a decimal. And I know 3 divided by 4 equals 0.75. So I could change time into 3.75 hours to make it easier when I plug it into the formula. I know that this 216.4 is going to be my distance. So when I plug them in, I get 216.4 equals the rate times 3.75 divided, and I get approximately 57.7. So my rate is about 57.7 miles per hour.